Before we get into the case tonight, I want to thank the show's sponsor, BetterHelp, for helping keep the flame lit of the campfire for this episode. BetterHelp is the world's largest therapy service that's 100% online. So you don't have that awkwardness of sitting in a waiting room with a whole bunch of other strangers waiting to see your therapist. With BetterHelp, you have access to a network of over 25,000 licensed and experienced therapists who can help you with whatever you're dealing with. All you have to do to get started is answer some questions about what your needs and preferences are in therapy. So that way, BetterHelp can match you with a therapist that is right for you. And if you want to change your therapist because maybe you're not comfortable with them, you can change your therapist at any time for no additional charge. You also don't have to wait any specific time or any number of sessions to change your therapist. So when you match up with that right therapist, you can talk to your therapist however is most comfortable for you, whether it's text, chat, phone, or video. You can also message your therapist at any time and schedule live sessions when it's convenient for you and your schedule. With BetterHelp, you get the same professionalism and quality you expect from in-office therapy, but with a therapist who is custom-picked for you with more scheduling flexibility and more affordable prices. So if you go to the website and use the show's code, betterhelp.com/CCC, not only does that let them know that you heard it at the campfire, but you'll also receive 10% off your first month. So that's betterhelp.com/CCC. BetterHelp, HELP.com/CCC. And I'll also have a link provided in the show notes. Eustis, Florida. Not many will have heard of Eustis, a small city in Lake County, Florida. Eustis is about 40 miles from Orlando and has a population a little over 19,000 people. Eustis has several festivals throughout the year, the biggest being in February for the George Fest, which is a festival honoring George Washington that's been a tradition for the city since 1902. Another reason for Eustis making headlines would be on November 25th, 1996, for a double homicide. 49-year-old Richard Wendorf and his wife, Naomi Queen, are enjoying an evening at home. Their 15-year-old daughter is at home with them and then leaves to go out, presumably to meet friends. 17-year-old Jennifer Wendorf is also out with her brand new car that her parents gave her. She is at work and then meets with friends before returning home. Jennifer had a 10 p.m. curfew, but was out past curfew when she was returning home. Sneaking in at night after being out with friends, she sees her father on the couch and appears to be sleeping, and sneaks past him. She turns into the kitchen, where she finds her mother laying in a pool of blood. In complete shock of what happened, realizing that her 15-year-old sister is missing when she calls the police. Welcome to the campfire. Grab your s'mores and grab a seat. Thanks for joining me tonight around the fire, where we discuss the dark world of true crime. This is the Campfire Crime Chronicles, a true crime podcast. And this is the Vampire Murders. So now we're going to get into some of the main characters of this case. Roderick Justin Farrell was born in March of 1980. His parents were just teenagers when Rod would be born in Murray, Kentucky. Rod would barely get to know his father, as he would join the military soon after his birth and then be raised primarily by his mother, Sandra Gibson. According to records, they would live on and off with her parents over the years. Farrell had claimed that he was raped by his maternal grandfather at the age of 5. However, nothing was ever proven if these allegations were true, and no charges were ever brought up against the grandfather. When not living with the Gibsons, the mother and son stayed in public housing, and Sandra supported them, working as an exotic dancer and occasionally as a sex worker. It was reported that Sandra and her sister were sexually assaulted by her father, Harold Gibson, and that Rod was 5 years old and would be exposed to it all. This would be the time when the allegations of when Harold and his friends would molest Rod as well. In an interview with the Orlando Sentinel, Sandra Gibson would admit to dabbling in vampirism. Then as a teenager, Rod would follow behind her, also getting into it. Already a fan of fantasy role-playing games such as Dungeons & Dragons and Vampire the Masquerade, Farrell fell in with other disaffected teenagers who professed to be living the vampire lifestyle. They drank each other's blood, they wore all black, and listened to specifically gothic and industrial music. Stephen Jaden Murphy also told the Orlando Sentinel that he brought Farrell in and crossed him over as a vampire. Jaden Murphy brought Farrell into the house, quote-unquote, as they called it, by bringing Farrell to the birthplace, which was a tombstone in a cemetery where they would conduct the ritual. According to Jaden, the ritual was that he cut his arm and Farrell would suck and drink the blood until he was content or the bleeding stopped, and Jaden did the same to Farrell. Jaden Murphy had a 14-year-old brother who Sandra Gibson would send lurid letters to Murphy's brother stating that she would be his bride for eternity as part of the vampire family. Sandra's parents had acquired a home in Eustis, Florida in 1990, so Rod and Sandra frequently went back and forth between Murphy, Kentucky and Eustis, Florida. And while in Eustis, Rod Farrell would meet Heather Wendorf, and the two would become close friends and click relatively quickly because their personalities would seem to match as described by sources. It was also said that Heather was a troubled high school sophomore who rebelled against her parents often over cleaning her room and other trivial tasks. During the 10th grade, Farrell moved back to Kentucky and would call Heather collect, all the time running up expensive phone bills upwards of about $800 for Heather's parents. For anyone who doesn't know what calling collect is or was, it was when you use collect to call someone and the person receiving the phone call would have to accept the charges to receive the call. A lot of people would call someone collect with a phrase, and then the person receiving would deny the charges after receiving the phrase, which was the name given as a way to get around the collect call charges. And some people would do this repeatedly with several phrases to get almost an entire conversation in. No one uses collect anymore, to my knowledge, except maybe prisons. So it wouldn't take too long for Heather's parents to put an end to the collect call charges, which would make Heather angry and fuming, according to her sister Jennifer. While in Murray, Kentucky, Farrell was telling everyone that he was a 500-year-old vampire named Visago, and would begin recruiting followers. Among them was a 16-year-old Howard Scott Anderson who came from grinding poverty with an alcoholic father who abused his mother, as stated by the Daily Commercial newspaper. Farrell's behavior would become increasingly unhinged, and in October of '96, he allegedly broke into Murray-Callaway County Animal Shelter and would gruesomely kill 2 puppies. According to the book The Vampire Killers, Farrell would be arrested on charges of burglary, trespassing, and cruelty to animals. In November of '96, Farrell, along with his 16-year-old girlfriend Charity Kessie, Howard Anderson, along with another girl, Dana Cooper, who was 19, drove to Eustis in Anderson's car to pick up Heather Wendorf. Farrell had this disarranged vision that the group would move to New Orleans and live together as a vampire family. He also believed that he was saving Heather from a troubled home. Heather would tell Farrell that her parents would abuse her and that she had expressed a strong desire to run away from home. According to reports on November 25th of 96, Farrell crossed Heather over to vampirism by drinking his blood in Eustis Cemetery. Farrell would take LSD and go to the Wendorf home to steal their car for the trip to New Orleans. So, along with living with the alcoholic, abusive father, Scott lived in a shack with garbage bags over broken windows, whose father was not only an alcoholic, but also a drug addict. Scott would meet Rod, and the two would become friends, and then eventually also meeting Jaden, who shared the same kind of views as Rod. The three would escape their hardship realities in RPGs or role-playing games such as Dungeons & Dragons. This would be before Rod would take on a more sinister type of lifestyle, vampirism. After Rod brought Scott into the life of vampirism, he would exchange blood with two other high school friends that he would also bring into vampirism, Charity Kessie and Dana Cooper. So why vampirism? This group shared something in common when they would get into vampirism. They lived in rural, sometimes remote, isolated areas. They may have felt kind of like outcasts and loners and felt like being in this group, they all shared something and would have something in common. Rod had this need feeling of having to lead his own group of followers. I think that was part of the reason why he brought in people to vampirism who he thought were worse off than him. Prior to leaving of Eustis, he met up with Jaden and they were walking through the woods when this cat walked up to them and he grabbed the cat and slammed it against a tree, killing it instantly. Farrell was beginning to form his own vision of vampirism. This would be when Jaden and Farrell would move apart from each other, having different views of the beliefs in the direction of vampirism and the way it should go and be taken. Farrell's vision was way more dark and diabolical. Scott Anderson and Jaden Murphy would state that Farrell would take his vampirism to the extreme and go as far as he felt that he needed to. Scott Anderson would say in an interview that Rod believed that if you drank the blood and take a life, you would gain a life. I want to thank the show's sponsor, BetterHelp, for helping keep the flame lit of the campfire for this episode. BetterHelp is the world's largest therapy service that's 100% online. So you don't have that awkwardness of sitting in a waiting room with a whole bunch of other strangers waiting to see your therapist. With BetterHelp, you have access to a network of over 25,000 licensed and experienced therapists who can help you with whatever you're dealing with. All you have to do to get started is answer some questions about what your needs and preferences are in therapy. So that way, BetterHelp can match you with a therapist that is right for you. And if you want to change your therapist because maybe you're not comfortable with them, you can change your therapist at any time for no additional charge. You also don't have to wait any specific time or any number of sessions to change your therapist. So when you match up with that right therapist, you can talk to your therapist however is most comfortable for you, whether it's text, chat, phone, or video. You can also message your therapist at any time and schedule live sessions when it's convenient for you and your schedule. With BetterHelp, you get the same professionalism and quality you expect from in-office therapy, but with a therapist who is custom-picked for you with more scheduling flexibility and more affordable prices. So if you go to the website and use the show's code, betterhelp.com/CCC, not only does that let them know that you heard it at the campfire, but you'll also receive 10% off your first month. So that's betterhelp.com/ccc. BetterHelp, HELP.com/ccc. And I'll also have a link provided in the show notes. While heading south towards Eustis, Florida, Rod told Scott and the others that they were going to pick up Heather and then head to New Orleans. Farrell told the others that New Orleans was the city of vampires, with other like-minded vampire people who would accept them, and that was the reasoning for going there. The group arrived in Eustis Sunday night and picked up Heather the following morning and went to a cemetery. Heather and Rod would walk off on their own for about 1 to 1.5 hours before returning to the others. While they were gone, this would be when Rod would bring Heather into vampirism. According to Heather, she instructed Farrell to not hurt or do anything to her parents and to leave them be when he went for the car. Farrell, Anderson, and the two girls met up with Heather about a quarter mile from her house. Rod told Anderson and the others the plan was to go to the house and get the Explorer to have something to drive. This plan was assumed by the others that this was something that Heather and Rod came up with while they were walking around the cemetery. The girls drive off in Scott's car while Scott and Farrell walk up to Heather's house. Scott would state he was in his own little world in his head with mixed emotions of being both excited and afraid at the same time. When Farrell and Anderson entered the Wendorf's home, they entered through the garage. This is where Farrell found a crowbar for his weapon of choice. The two boys entered the house through a utility room door. According to documents, when he entered, a 49-year-old Richard Wendorf was asleep on the couch. Farrell struck him repeatedly on the head and bludgeoning him to death. This would be when both boys would be confronted by Naomi Queen, who had been showering in another part of the house. She threw a cup of coffee on Farrell that would scratch him and probably leave some sort of burns. And Farrell would attack her. Naomi put up her arms and attempt to defend herself, but Farrell would strike so hard with the crowbar, it severed her brainstem, killing her instantly. As described by Scott in an interview, what Farrell did to Naomi was worse than Richard. The Orlando Sentinel reported that after both victims were given ritualistic burns, Farrell and Anderson would continue to search the house for any valuables and would leave after stealing a credit card, some jewelry, and the family's blue Ford Explorer. This is when 17-year-old Jennifer Wendorf, Heather's older sister, returns home and discovers her parents' bodies when she returned home that night when she got home from work. Farrell and Scott met the girls on a dirt road, and Scott would switch the license plates before the group would drive off. Heather wouldn't realize her parents had been killed until after she left town. When Farrell would tell Heather, Dana, and Charity what happened and that he killed her parents, and the girls would be shell-shocked, and Heather would put on a show for the others to keep up the persona of a poor, abused girl by her father, which I think we've concluded at this point was false statement by Heather. The bloody crowbar was in the back with the girls, and they were moving around and not wanting to touch it or get their feet close to it. When Jennifer was asked who she thought could have done this, Jennifer immediately told detectives that Heather had a friend who moved back to Murray, Kentucky, and his name was Rod Farrell. She would tell police that her sister was hanging out with a bad group of people that were dangerous, with Rod Farrell being one of them. She would go on to explain that him and Heather would go and hang out at cemeteries at night and that they acted bizarrely, and when the police asked her what she meant by bizarre, all she was able to say was vampires. Detectives would begin calling Murray, Kentucky, and the pieces would begin fitting together relatively quickly. That's when they learn a bit more about Rod Farrell. They also put a bolo with the tags out on the blue Ford Explorer, and Seminole County found the tags, but not the blue Explorer. Seminole County is southeast of Eustis and northeast of Orlando. The license plate was on a different vehicle, and when Seminole County ran the VIN number, it belonged to Scott Anderson. This tells law enforcement that the blue Explorer is bearing a Kentucky tag belonging to Scott Anderson. At this point, it was still a guess as to where the group was going. Law enforcement was trying to figure out where they were going, believing maybe they were going to Daytona area. But Jennifer believed that they were heading to Louisiana. On November 27th, murder warrants were issued for all 5 teenagers, including Heather Wendorf. It wouldn't be until Charity calls her grandmother that would be the lead investigators were needing to be able to trace the call and lead it back to a payphone in Baton Rouge. It had been 2 to 3 days at this point when Farrell begins getting antsy and nervous, telling Scott that the cops will be looking for them. So while in Baton Rouge, they go down to this lake or pond to dump the murder weapon. The group at this point is running on fumes. They're not sleeping and they're in need of money. Charity tells Rod and Scott that her mom might be able to help them and be the best option. And when she reaches out to her mother, she ends up getting her grandmother, which her grandmother says she'll relay the message, but instead goes to detectives to tell them what Charity had said. And detectives tell the grandmother to call her back and that she'll give her the money. So the grandmother calls Charity back and tells her to go to the Howard Johnson to check in, where police will be waiting for them, unknowing of the others, including Charity, of what would happen. When they arrived, Scott shut the car off, and immediately the cops surrounded the Explorer, and the group was arrested and charged, everyone, including Heather, with murder of Naomi and Richard Wendorf. When in custody, Farrell would play the role of vampire supervillain to the hilt. During an interview with the Orlando Sentinel, he would claim that he was being framed by a rival group of vampires and that he held multiple personalities, and that he was trying to ditch being a vampire. When photographed, he would stick his tongue out. Despite his show of defiance, Farrell would plead guilty to the burglary, 2 counts of first-degree murder, and at the start of his trial on February 5th, 1998, this would be in hopes of receiving a life sentence instead of the death penalty. Weeks later, his sentencing hearing, Judge Jerry Lockett would state, "I think you are a disturbed young man. I think your family failed you. I think society failed you," and then would deliver the death sentence for Farrell. This would later be overturned to a life sentence by the Supreme Court. Farrell's mother during the trial was depicted by Farrell's defense attorneys, psychologists, and also psychiatrists as a mentally ill parent who was a prostitute, a former cult member who attempted to solicit a 14-year-old boy for sex in a vampire initiation rite. Before the trial would begin in 1998, Farrell's mother would state that her involvement with vampirism was Hollywood idiocy. However, while on a break during the trial, Sandra Gibson turned to the state attorney, Brad King, as well as a group of reporters and told them, quote, "We live forever." Scott would state he didn't commit the murders, but he would be in the house with Farrell while the murders happened. He would also plead guilty in April of 1998, and in Florida, there's this thing called felony murder. Scott avoids the death penalty and would receive 2 life sentences. Had Scott never met Farrell, there's a possibility he would have turned out all right and stayed out of prison and succeeding in life. Scott Anderson's sentence would get his sentence reduced to 40 years with credit at time served, and he'll be 51 when he's released. Dana and Charity would accept plea deals in exchange for reduced sentences. Dana got 17.5 years, and Charity got 10.5 years. There was some debate on how to charge or prosecute Heather in her parents' death. They opted to not prosecute Heather in the deaths of her parents. Heather denied having anything to do with her parents' death, but did go to Baton Rouge with the group, stating she only learned of her parents' death after they had already left town. To the best of my knowledge, Heather and her sister, Jennifer, stayed distant and disconnected with no interactions. So where is Rod Ferrell now? Ferrell is currently imprisoned at the Tomoka Correctional Institution in Volusia County, Florida. Ferrell was only 17 when he was sentenced to death. He holds the record for the youngest prisoner in America on death row. In November of 2000, the Orlando Sentinel reported that Ferrell's death sentence was commuted to life in prison after the Florida Supreme Court ruled that defendants must be 17 or older when they commit a crime for execution, which at the time of the murders and convictions, he was 16. Ferrell would again sought to have his life sentence reduced back in 2020. However, a judge would deny his request, stating in his decision for the denial was that the prisoner was irreparably corrupt, which is probably a fair judgment by the judge after looking at the psyche of Ferrell. During the resentencing, Ferrell spoke and apologized for the murders. Heather Wendorf's sister, Jennifer Wendorf, testified at Ferrell's 2020 resentencing hearing, sharing that the murders have deeply traumatized her, having been the person to find her parents' bodies. She would go on to say that Ferrell defiantly shouldn't be released from prison. Jennifer would tell the judge at the resentencing, quote, "May I have a place that's not traumatized by looking over my shoulder if he ever gets out." Mental health experts spoke and testified at Ferrell's resentencing hearing, stating that the once vampire cult leader had changed. So where is Heather now? An Orlando Sentinel profile from 2006 found Heather was married and studying art in North Carolina. Though alienated from her family, I attempted to do a search on her but wasn't able to locate any information on Heather or any social medias that are current. Twice, grand juries declined to press charges against her for having any part in the murder of her parents, as she was in a car with two other people at the time of the crime and did not know about the murders until after they had already left town. That concludes this case at the campfire. Thank you for joining me tonight around the fire for this year's Halloween episode. I know there is more information that I didn't include in this story, as there was a lot of information to cover. All resources used to gather the information for the case include, but not limited to, news articles, reports, documentaries, and other resources. I appreciate everyone who has gathered by the campfire with me for this case. I appreciate all the support from all the listeners and supporters. Word of mouth is the best support for the show. So tell your friends, family, coworkers, even the guy next to you in the coffee line, or someone you meet at a bonfire when you go to this fall. Also, if you wish to support the show and not necessarily sign up for a subscription, you can support the show with the S'mores Fund through the website CampfireCrimeChronicles.com. A link will be provided in the show notes. Also, keep a lookout on social media and future episodes for an announcement of the bonfire with bonus episodes coming out. Check out the merchandise store where you can find t-shirts, hats, mugs, and hoodies for the fall while you're at those bonfires. Links will also be provided in the show notes, but you can also find the links to the store at CampfireCrimeChronicles.com. Don't forget, wherever you're listening, to rate the show 5 stars. It helps the show be seen by everyone else in the podcast apps. So join me next time in 2 weeks as we gather around the campfire for the next case that we get into. Remember to sleep with one eye open. I'm your host, Kevin, and this is the Campfire Crime Chronicles. a true crime podcast.